day we got engaged, when's the wedding? When are you guys going to get married? And then we get married, and then we're like at our wedding, we're like, so we're going to have kids soon? And I'm like, what is this game? Like, it's just a continual, perpetual, there's always the next thing. And finding the ability to sit in somewhere. So like, I'm curious, even in this room, how many of you are in school? Okay, very good. How many of you are in the workforce? Already in the workforce? So that, good. How many of you are full-time? And then some of you doing both, probably, part-time and school? Anybody working anyone in school? Great, yeah. God bless you.
Awesome.
So yeah, hopefully some of these things will be helpful for you as you process. We don't have this magical, special tool or thing that you're going to walk out here with and be like, I know what I'm supposed to do with the rest of my life. Because I think that's the beauty of it. Just like as Christ followers, we become more and more like Christ in our walk. I think the same is true as we understand our calling. The more we understand how God's gifted us in the ways that we can contribute to the world around us, this is a continual, ongoing process within our life. So,
I think it might look different. God has uniquely created each one of us with specific gifts and specific talents to be used for His glory. For me, I'm not funny, and I know I'm not funny, so I don't try to be funny. Okay, I just own that. Like, Austin is the funny one. He makes everyone laugh. He lights up the room, and then just me laugh. I'm like, can you please tell me I make you laugh like this once? But I know the gifts that God has given me. Mercy is one of my gifts. And so I can sit with someone and I feel their pain. I'm like, girl, you're crying, I'm crying. Like, you feel that, I feel that. I'm carrying that burden with you. And so if I was to look at Austin and say, man, I just want to be the funny one. And then I try to be funny and it just never works. I just gotta walk in my calling. I have to own who I am, own the gifts that I have, rather than letting comparison steal my joy and steal what I think I should be or try to become something I'm not. Because God knows who you are. He knows who He's called you to be. And all He's looking at you saying is, I just want you to do what I've asked you to do. I just want you to be obedient to what I put in front of you. That's all I'm asking you to do right now.
In the book of Psalms it says, man determines his plans, but God determines his steps. So it's not wrong to plan. So don't hear us wrong. It's not wrong to say, oh, I have career aspirations to do this. Or I feel like God's really gifted me in these ways and I want to contribute to society in these ways. None of that's wrong. But to be able to identify, God, what are the steps that you're having me take? How can I be obedient to my today? Which is the point. So every day, not a Sunday. It's kind of what we're talking about. Our calling is often seen, again, your first blank there, our calling is often seen as a Sunday. Right? One day when I get a job and I work the corporate ladder and I can be, head to the C-suite, I'm the CEO or the CFO if you like numbers or whatever it is. One day when I'm a manager, one day when I have this job or this title, people strive for those things. And again, it's a mirage, just like anything in our life. We think we're going to get somewhere and then we never actually do. Or we end up getting there and it doesn't fulfill us the way we thought it was going to fulfill. So again, this is a lie from Satan that's distracting us from the everyday that God has on us. Our calling should be something that we live out every day of our lives. Every day of our lives. We have an ability to do that through Christ. So there's some things here I want to talk to just over the past couple of years, right? COVID has changed a lot of how the world works. There's a lot of remote working, and we don't have time to dive into all of this, but if you start looking into this idea of remote work, which is actually really amazing, there's a lot of cool things that come with it, but something to be mindful of that in that space is it's very transactional, right? Because you're all removed from everybody, and there's less person-to-person interaction. Whether that's just text that's going back and forth, or Slacks, or Teams, whatever method of communication you're using, the interpersonal ability to interact with somebody, see someone's facial expression, somebody's body language, it's transactional. As opposed to some traditional forms of work to be able to work with other people in the same room, that's more relational, right? So it's not that remote work is bad, but you have to remember that the relational needs that are part of the human condition, those aren't seen within the workplace as much. So there's this transactional thing. So all throughout the past couple of years, COVID has changed a bunch of these things. But there's, I don't know if you guys have heard this term, the Great Resignation, over the past 2 years. And to give you an idea, you have it on your sheet, but 47 million people quit their jobs in 2021. Just quit their jobs, which was an all-time high, by the way, until the next year. In 2022, 50 million people quit their jobs. So there's this unrest, this great resignation, this idea of moving from job to job, and 80% of those people quit their jobs because they claim there's a better job offer or title, right? So status increase or pay increase. So clearly, and I don't know these numbers, but I would be interested. I was talking to a friend of mine about this week. I'd be interested how many of the 50 million people in 2022 were the same ones from the year prior. Because there's other studies. Let's see, you guys have that. The other studies for the U.S. workforce, 70% of people intend to be at their current organization in 12 months, which means if there is 10 people working in a company, 3 of those people are already considering and actively looking for something else. So stability within the job market, stability within workplace is very much so transient, very much so moving. And the question to really think, okay, so I came to this thing with like faith and work, this is what it's all to me. We're talking a lot about job because job and work often get conflated with identity. Often get conflated with identity. And we have to be careful of that. I work here at the church. I've had the privilege of being able to work here for 10 years. My identity is not what I do here. My identity is who I am in Christ and the gifts that He's given me to contribute to the world around me, to help the world. That's what Jay was talking about this morning, right? That the world would see the light of Christ within me. This is the point of calling. So I don't know if you have anything.
Yeah, the point of work being conflated with identity, so much of when you meet people, it's, hey, I'm Corey, what's your name? Oh, what do you do? Are you in school? What do you do for a living? And so easily that can get wrapped up into, oh, well, that's just what I am. I'm a software engineer. I'm a teacher. I'm in masonry. I'm a doctor. I'm a lawyer. And it's like, but are you? Is that really all you are? Is that really all that God has created you to do, created you to be in this world? So just like Austin said, work gets conflated with identity. So if you think about the rest of your life moving forward, the majority of us would work about 90,000 hours in a lifetime. 90,000 hours in a job. Whether that's a stay-at-home mom or the CEO of a company, you're working 90,000 hours. It's pretty alarming, right? It's like, wow, I understand why people say I should like what I do because the majority of the time I spend is working. But the important thing to remember is that work is not sinful. Work was actually created for good. It was created before the fall. And I think as believers, sometimes we forget that. Or I want to work less, or I don't want to work so hard. But God didn't actually create work as a punishment. He created it to be lived out and to be lived out for His purposes and to be used as restoration pieces in His world.
I think, sorry, just jumping in too. So when we're going to keep drilling into calling, so if you're still a little fuzzy, like, cool, we're good with that. We'll get into that, but I just want to make the distinction clear. If we're pursuing and chasing after a career, then we're not chasing after a calling. Because career is different than calling. Job title, and here's my list of things that I do, my job description, is much different than my identity in Christ, how I'm wired based upon how God put me together, and how I contribute to the world around me as a result. Right? So one thing is imposed to say, this job description is imposing on me, this job is imposing on me, this is then therefore who I am and what I do. The other is inverse from the inside out to say, this is how God has made me, this is how I can contribute to the world around me. Right? They're two different things. And it's easy to, and culturally, it's easy to just find identity in what your job is, what your job title is. And that's why we said, like, anytime you have a conversation with somebody, hey, what's your name? My name is Austin, what's your whatever. Next question, very next question, 99% of the time, what do you do? Because who we are and what we do is so closely tethered. So we have to be careful as Christ followers not to fall into that trap and understand, okay, I've been gifted in a certain way, therefore I can go and impact the world around me for Christ in those ways.
And it's so important to not lose sight of your purpose and of your calling. If any of us felt like, ooh, I'm kind of starting to question my purpose or my calling, or what am I actually doing? Am I even contributing? Am I even changing in the world? Am I making, something extraordinary for people around me. I know I have totally felt that, especially in the mundane parts of life, where it's just like, all right, I'm really tired of getting up early and going to work day after day after day. But something I want to encourage us in, looking back to Israel, when they were wandering in the desert, God allowed Israel to wander. He didn't just make that quick change easy for them. He allowed them to wander. So a journey that was supposed to take 11 days took 40 years. He allowed that. So do you think that Israel might have questioned their purpose? Generation after generation, they're just hanging out in the desert, getting sand in their eyes, and they're like, are we ever getting to the promised land? Is this ever happening, God? Is this all you have for me? And something I often ask myself is, Lord, if that's what you have for my life, am I okay with that? Let me just let that sit for a second. If all you have for me to do is to wander in the desert for a whole generation, am I okay with that? And if I'm being honest, sometimes it's really hard to say yes. Because we have this American dream where I want to make it and I want to have it all. But God doesn't necessarily call us to have it all or call us to make it. He calls us to be faithful. He calls us to be obedient to Him, to be obedient to what's put right in front of us. And so I don't want us to lose heart in that. But the beauty is that God set Israel apart on purpose. He made them separate. He made them distinct. And He did that so that everyone that would be looking at Israel would be able to see God. And I wonder if maybe we can realize that that might be our purpose too. That when people look at us and they see our life, us being set apart as believers, that maybe God's allowing them to see Himself.
It's a good question to ask. Because, and maybe that means we're going to have to start asking questions. I know there's kind of a split room as far as who's in the workforce and who's in school, but ultimately, the things that we're doing in school are leading into someplace in the work field. And when we get to some of those spots, a lot of the questions start to revolve around, well, what's the next promotion I can get? Well, how much money can I make? And all of those are decisions that need to be thought through and prayed through. But they're not the end-all be-all. They're not the ultimate decider on things, right? And how do we begin to ask questions? So if we're really to drill down biblically, if Israel was made and God chose these people, and we heard from Jay this morning that we're a royal priesthood, that we're God's beloved. If that's really true, okay, then the questions we need to ask ourselves are not what job can I get that makes the most money, and I'm just going to take that job. Because coming out of college, those of you that are coming out of college or those of you that are looking for work, if the question is just what job can I get that makes me the most money, well, then you're going to be very discontent in a job that makes a lot of money. And ultimately, that's not going to be fulfilling. If you started asking different questions, and if God was really on a restoration mission to restore the world back to Himself through His Son Jesus, then how do we ask questions differently? And maybe it starts with God doing the work inside of you first. So maybe the first question we have to ask ourselves is, God, what do you want to restore in me? What are the things that I'm refusing to let go of? What are the idols in my life? Whether that could be money, and that could be status. All of that could be true. But maybe asking God, hey, would you root out the idol of status in my life? Would you root out the idol of status so that I might be a servant for Christ? That I wouldn't pursue status, but I would pursue being a servant? Would you root out the idol of money in my life? So that I might be able to serve others generously because you're a generous God to me? When you start asking different questions and say, God, what do you want to restore in me first? Because we're Christ's ambassadors. We're His royal priesthood that goes out into the world. So what do you want to do in me? And then the second thing we can ask is, Lord, what do you want to restore around me? Because you all know broken people, and you're probably all involved in a lot of broken systems. And the hope of the gospel is that God is restoring all things back to Himself. So we are a part of the restoration process of broken people and broken things. And don't shortly forget, we are broken people, only made whole in Christ. So let's be careful how fast we judge others, but remind ourselves that we are a part of the restoration mission that God has done. So, God, what do you want to do in me first? God, what do you want me to do? And then how can I, as a whole individual, as someone that follows Christ, that lives like Christ, that's what Christian means, little Christ. As people look at me just as they looked at Israel and they see God, how can I influence the world around broken systems and broken people such that they might see you? These are the questions that we begin to ask and can ask ourselves. And then that's where we start. Because if you start with how much money can I make, and what status can I get, what job title can I get, it's a lot harder to backtrack some of that stuff and kind of force fit some of those things in there.
We have the opportunity now, being in our young 20s, maybe mid to late 20s, we have the opportunity now where we're not decades into it. Just like Austin was saying, it's so much easier now to start with, God, I'm putting you number one. That idol on my heart, that just like Austin was saying, status, money, I want to actively take that off of my heart and put you back on it. And that's sometimes a daily process, right? I think there's probably sin in our life that it's a daily process to say no to, right? And sometimes it's really tough. And choosing to find those idols, rip them out of your heart, is a daily thing. Say, nope, oh wow, you're back. Okay, rip you out again. Let me replace that with you, Jesus. Oh my gosh, next day, you're back. Let me rip that out and replace that with you, Jesus. So important.
Yeah. So, again, for some of these blanks, God, what do you want to restore in me today? Restore. Lord, what do you want to restore in the world around me today? Is that a question? We are tools and vessels that God wants to restore the world back to himself. And we're ambassadors of reconciliation and restoration of the world. We point people to him through our works and our words. And our greatest process in the restoration work that God is endeavoring towards. You don't have to change your job to join this work, right? You don't have to change your job, you don't have to change your school, you don't have to change any of those things. But rather, begin to ask different questions. And don't chase the same things that everyone else is chasing. Romans 12:2 tells us that. Don't conform to the patterns of this world, be transformed by the renewing of your mind. What do you want to renew in me? What do you want to restore in me? This is the call of a Christ follower in that. So let's kind of dig a little bit deeper into some of this. Let's get a little bit practical, and we're gonna have some time. You guys can ask some questions, and I really want you to kind of play around with this, think through this. Like it's a difficult thing, and something that Corey and I are still processing through. We're taking a class on some of these things, and it's helping us to reshape and frame how we think. So it's not something like, okay, we sit here for half an hour and we all leave and we're ready to go. Like this takes some time and processing. So feel free to ask questions in a little bit and talk through some of this. But as Christ followers on a basic level, Christian work is good work. Dorothy Sayers was an author in the 1900s, and she said that only Christian work is work well done. So it's not definitive to say Christian work is only working at a church. No, all work is for the service of God. We're all called to be servants of Christ. Therefore, we're all called to do ministry. Some are called into service to God. Sure, some are called to full-time vocational ministry, but all are called to ministry. So it doesn't matter where you are, where you work, where you go to school, what dorm you're in, what coffee shop you find yourself at. We're all called to ministry. So it's not just the people who get a paycheck to work at a church or to work vocationally for any of those things. All believers, and that's what James was talking about again this morning, but the royal priesthood, all of us together, being ambassadors for Christ, the royal priesthood, God's possession, such that we might be the salt and the light of the earth around us. So that, and then Martin Luther King Jr., you may have heard this quote, but it says, if it falls your lot to be a street sweeper, again, because we like to think, I'll pause it, this is his quote, but so we like to think about these grand jobs, right? This amazing job that one day I'll have, and I'll do this, and then I'll really make a difference in the world. As if you can't make a difference in your world today. But we think about these big things, and Martin Luther King Jr. was giving a sermon himself and talking about how do we just be faithful with what God's given us today. And he says this, if it falls into your lot to be a street sweeper, sweep streets like Michelangelo painted pictures, sweep streets like Beethoven composed music, sweep streets like Shakespeare wrote poetry, sweep streets so well that all the hosts of heaven and earth will have to pause and say, here lived a great great, street sweeper.
Say that 5 times
Who
fast.
swept his job well. This is the point. Whatever God is calling you to, whether you think it's big or small, it's part of God's grand plan that He's using to work all things together. If the Bible is true, that God works all things together for His good, according to those who love Him. Well, if we as Christ followers claim to love Him, then it doesn't matter, to Corey's point, if that means wandering in the wilderness. Whatever it means, our only call is to be faithful to the King. That's our call. So it's not a matter of, well, I'll be faithful to God, or I'll make a difference or make an impact if I can be the CEO, if I can be the president, if I can be the principal of this school, if I can do this or that. It's not that at all. Rather, it's, God, how can I be faithful with mine today? The greatest call on all of us is to be faithful to our every day, to whatever circumstances and situation, to be sensitive to the Spirit's leading in every moment of every day. Which means it doesn't matter whether you're on the clock or not. It doesn't matter if you're at work or not. So as you walk into the grocery store, or as you go to the food hall at your school, or as you walk into your workplace, all of those moments are holy, sacred moments that God is working in your life. And we have the responsibility as believers to be sensitive to the Spirit's leading within it. And when we're sensitive to the Spirit's leading within it, we can be faithful to the opportunities that God gives us. But if we're too busy thinking about the future and the what if and when I's, then we're going to miss the opportunities that God's put right in front of us. So don't think that what's in front of you is insignificant, because it's often those insignificant things that build on themselves, and they become the very thing that God uses to do really big things. It's just being faithful in the moment, each and every day, which is the harder thing. Because you think it's easier when it's just down the road, when I do this or when I have that. It's not the case. We have to continue to build those things. Those who are faithful with little, are trusted with much. So we need to begin to ask these types of questions. So again, Christian work is good work. That we would be examples to those around us. When they see the work that we do, it would look different than the world. Because we're giving it all. We don't cut corners. Because we're not doing it to get a paycheck. We're not doing it to appease our boss. We're not doing it to look better. Rather, we're doing it because this is the thing that God's called us to be obedient to in this moment. We're going to do it with everything we have. So, why don't you drill in a little bit of your story, Core, and how that plays out in your world in medicine?
Yeah, so my calling, just like I mentioned earlier, one of my gifts is mercy. So my calling is to care for the broken, the forgotten, and the vulnerable. That is what I know God's calling to. And right now I'm doing that as a doctor. I'm a resident doctor in a program through UV. And my calling kind of started when I was in 8th grade. I didn't know the Lord at that time, which is really cool because God knew me, but I didn't know Him. And I took a field trip with some of my classmates downtown Rochester, where I'm from. And it was the middle of winter, and we were actually washing the feet of people who were experiencing homelessness. And this guy named Saul that I met, I still remember him. He had the opportunity to change his socks in about 3 months. And this is in the dead of slushy, icy, cold winter. So we're peeling his socks off after we've soaked his feet in hot water. And you can imagine the sores that this guy probably had on his feet. I mean, think about when you go swimming for too long and your feet are like soggy and wrinkly, right? Think about how much that might hurt. And think about the smell. There's an odor, right? You don't shower for a couple days, sometimes there's an odor, right? And I just got to sit there, and I got to talk to him, and wash this guy's feet. And there were doctors and dentists and nurses all around me. I was a 13-year-old girl seeing these people give up their free time to care for people that are forgotten and are vulnerable and are homeless. And I thought, oh my gosh, if I could do something like this with my life, if I could try to be part of something like this, then I think that'd be really cool. It's like a 13-year-old girl. So fast forward, now I'm in a residency program. I'm a second-year resident doctor, and that's what I'm called to every day. I'm called to care for the broken, the vulnerable, and the forgotten. And that means sitting down with my patients who have lost loved ones, who've gotten terminal illnesses, who have had to tell, you have a terminal cancer and you don't have much time left, who who have broken relationships with their kids, their spouses, and listen and restore back to them the dignity and love that they deserve as image bearers of Christ. And that might look different for every single one of us. Right? It's not a specific restriction or path. It's who has God made you to be, what gifts has He given you, and how are you using those gifts to restore the people around you day by day, day in and day out.
For me, so I work at a church, so sometimes people think I only work on Sundays. So I don't. So some people think that. Some people think we just put on things like Spark, like we're event planners and we organize things for people to serve within the church and serve our city, and those are true, sure. But those aren't what I would say my calling is. Right? My occupation or my job title, some of that stuff falls within that, but ultimately I feel like God has called me to equip and invest and develop others towards a holy discipline in life. And what that means is, okay, if we're called in Matthew 28 to go, therefore go and make disciples, then my life has to look like that. That God's called me and given me influence over people, whether that's those in my family, those in Corey's family, that those at church, or those that are serving within our ministries, all of that I now have a responsibility and a calling to help all of us see that we need to live more like Christ in our everyday life. So it's not a matter of just doing certain programmatic things or doing this or that, but rather zooming out. And a lot of that is drawn back, and you don't have to have like this moment where everything clicks. But for me, a lot of my calling comes from when I was in middle school as well. And I came from a Catholic background, so it was very much so, ritualistic, and there was these things, and I always joke that it's true. Like, I'm not the best reader anyways, but when we would do the hymns, and we would go, I didn't realize until I was like 12 that the hymn page is different or the hymn number is different than the page number. So, right, the game. So I'm sitting there, and they're like, hymn 122, and I'm like page 122, and I was like, this is not the same song. So it's all this, right? And then rituals, and stand up and sit down, and then open your Bible at this point, go to this hymnal, and pray this prayer this way. And then we ended up going to a different church, and my youth pastor helped me to realize, okay, God's given all of us unique, different gift sets. He's given us all of our personality, and He's given us these things not so that we can conform to a certain pattern or a certain ritual, but rather that we would be transformed and use those giftings and use that personality and use the life that God has given us for His good, that we would be salt in the light of the earth, that people would look at us and they would see Jesus with it. And that changed the trajectory of my life. So much so that I was like, that's what I want to do. If I could do that for one person, like my youth pastor did it for me, like I'm all in. And that set the trajectory of my life. So my calling is not to just work on Sundays. My calling is not to just put on a program. My calling is not to lead worship or any of those things. My calling is rather to say, how can I come alongside other people and help them to see the thing that changed my life? And help them to understand the thing that has radically changed the trajectory of how I live and who I live for. That's my calling. And by the way, I could do that in a lot of other jobs. I don't have to work at a church to do that. Just like Corey can express her giftings of mercy and kindness and compassion, she doesn't have to be a doctor to do that. So we have to be careful not to just compartmentalize and say, well, one day when I get this certain job, then I'll be able to do my calling. No, I can live out the calling that God has on my life in a number of different jobs. So therefore, I can't let my job be my identifier. I can't let my job be the place that I find my identity and my worth, but rather in who Christ has made me and how I can contribute to the world.
I think that's a great point. Something that was helpful for me that I continue to come back to, because sometimes people look at me and say, oh, you probably went into medicine for the paycheck. Or they look at you with a different lens when you walk into a room. And it's like, no. I'm not a doctor. I'm a daughter. I'm trying to be faithful to what God has put before me. And I think that's so important to remember, whether you're working in ministry, whether you're in vocational day in, day out, thinking about how you can love and serve the church, or whether you're working in a world that does not know Christ. majority of your friends and coworkers don't know Jesus, and they've never heard of him, or they have no interest in knowing about him. All of that work is sacred, and I think sometimes we forget that. All of those moments are sacred.
And that's the point for today, right? Your calling is an everyday, not a Sunday. That's one thing, that your calling is an everyday, not a Sunday. You can make dreams and plans and hopes, but for what? If it's all a mirage, and if you get there and it doesn't fulfill. But if we change that and begin to ask different questions, looked at it differently, began to say, God, every day given me has a calling. That I look at my everyday as a calling that you've given me, such that I might influence the world around me using the gifts, abilities, personalities, talents, everything that you've given me. I want to serve others with it. And we begin to shape that look differently, which means your everyday calling can begin to look more like living generously out of the abundance of a generous king. So instead of being greedy and how can I gain more money, even Corey and I have talked a lot about even what do we do with our finances. And we don't ask the question, how much of my money should I give to God? When you talk about the tithes and offerings, right? How much of my money, how much of Corey and I's money that we make should we give to the church? Should we give to organizations? It's not the question we ask. We genuinely ask the question, how much of God's money, if God owns all things, if Genesis 1 is true, that he made all things, therefore everything belongs to him, including me, and all of my money. Because God's bank account doesn't run low. So, God, how much of your money should I keep for myself? It's a totally different mindset shift, totally different perspective. It gives you a healthy view on money, as opposed to letting money be the root of all evil, as Jesus has said. Because it can run some dangerous things in your life if you let it run on. So, to live generously out of the abundance of King Jesus.
Your everyday calling is to chase Christ, who calls us redeemed in a royal priesthood. Your everyday calling is to chase Christ rather than chasing the culture, chasing your career, is to chase Jesus.
Your everyday calling is the presence of Christ, right? As opposed to chasing after, hustling after, getting after all of these other things, that your pursuit would be towards the presence of Christ in your life.
I know we've talked about this more and more tonight, but your everyday calling is to discover how the Spirit has gifted you individually and how you can contribute to the restoration process of the world back to God.
Your everyday calling is to rest in the rhythms of grace Christ extends to all who follow. So to rest in the rhythms of grace, as opposed to filling our schedules or trying to achieve certain things, titles, positions, jobs, all of that stuff. What would it look like for us to rest? Jesus says, come to me all who are weary and heavy laden, I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you, it's easy and it's light. Because what happens in hustle culture, what happens when we're continuing trying to get the next thing, climb the corporate ladder, it's exhausting. And you see it. You know people that have been burned out, even early in their work careers, because they're chasing. And if we're not careful to rest as Christ followers in Christ, who's given us that rest, who's given us that yoke, we'll burn ourselves right out of the way.
Your everyday calling is to make disciples of Jesus. I love this one. Our everyday calling is not to make a fan squad for you, pump you up, encourage you. All those things are good. We want people to encourage you, to lift you up when you're down. But our everyday calling is to make disciples of Jesus, to show Christ to those around us.
Your everyday calling is to be salt and light of Christ to neighbors God has placed around you. So whether that's on your floor in a dormitory, whether that's your coworker who works in the cubicle next to you, all of those things are intentional. Because ultimately, the gospel, God does the changing of hearts, but when we gain the ability and the influence in someone's life to speak into it, and we can do that through influence, as opposed to a bullhorn, as opposed to just walking up to somebody random. When you have influence in someone's life and they've seen your example as you've lived out your calling, this is when we have the greatest ability to speak into, be the salt of light, and share the hope that Christ is in all of it.
Your everyday calling is to allow the Spirit of God to infiltrate every aspect and area of your life and to be obedient to His leading. Who here has felt the call of God or the Spirit leading you to do something and you're like, oh gosh. Anyone, can you lift your hand up if you felt that? Right. Spirit of God living in you, saying, hey, I know more than you do right now. I see this differently than you do, so please go obey me. Go obey me and restore.
And by the way, when you ignore that voice and you're not obedient to it, then don't shame yourself so much that God doesn't want that you miss another opportunity that God wants to use you in. Right? So cool. Learn from it. Pray, God, would you give me courage next time to act in it, and then next time it comes out. Okay? You don't need to shame yourself to the ground. Your everyday calling is to infuse the world around you with faith, hope, and love that comes only through Jesus.
So to sum this all up, your everyday calling is not where you are headed, but it's who God is making you to be. I'm going to say that again. Your everyday calling is not where you are headed. It's not a destination. It's who God is making you to be right now. Right now.
Which is where we're landing. Your calling is an everyday, not a Sunday. Your calling is an everyday, not a Sunday. Again, there's a lot of processing that goes in, a lot of practice that comes into this, a lot of ability to talk through some of these things. But chew on some of this stuff. If it's really true that I'm not just going to pursue a job title, a position, a certain organization that I want to work for, if my hope is not to just do all of those things, but instead to ask God, how have you gifted me and how can I contribute to the world around me? It's a game changer. It's a game changer. So, we got a few minutes. If anybody has a question that they want to ask, or something they're pondering, if you think we're full of bogus, let me know. Email Corey. Yeah.
I have an opportunity to get a job in New York City, and it's really interesting because I feel like there's a lot more people I can pour into here, and I'm wondering, I left my other job for a separate job, I got laid off, and now this job is almost starting, but it's because I wanted to further my career, but maybe, I don't know, if I stay in Buffalo, I do see a lot of opportunities to pour into people, just for people to take. That's all.
No, that's a great thing to have to work through, right? And anytime there's an obstacle in our lives, I often think or pray, God, what opportunity or what thing are you trying to do in my life? And it's actually a gift, right? So this crossroad in your life is not a trial that you might be beaten down, but rather it's an opportunity that God might want to refine you and allow you to hear His Spirit. Because I often find in moments like that, I can hear God's voice more clearly because I'm pursuing it and chasing after it more and harder. So, off the top of my head, questions to be asking, okay, if my point is that Christ followers become more like Christ so that when I stand before Him, I would be more like Him than when I first gave my life to Him, right? To become more like Christ. Does staying here help you to do that more? Do you have a group of people that you're accountable to, that you have community with, that can help push you towards those things, right? Even when Corey was talking about like having your fan club and do that, like that's good, but if that fan club's not also challenging you in ways to become more like Christ, then we need to think differently about the community or maybe find a different community. So thinking about those things, but that doesn't mean that God's not calling you somewhere else to shape you in a different way. So I would continue to go before Him in prayer and ask some of those questions. Find some godly counsel, seek Him through His Word, godly counsel in your life. That's good. But I'm excited for it. It's good to think about. Yeah. Anything else?
I think one thing to add on to that is that God often confirms things in different ways. So whether it's through a mentor that you're talking with, through somewhere where you're reading in the morning, a song lyric that just really pops out at you, God speaks in that voice to us. He makes it very clear when He has something specific.
Well, I'll add one thing. I had an opportunity when I was younger to go to a different place, bigger place, whatever. Like it was a better, quote unquote, outside world type thing. And I ended up saying no to that opportunity. But what I learned was, or what I put my hope in, and now I know it's true, is you guys don't know what a Rolodex is. You guys are too small or too young. So like my prayer was, okay, God, like wherever you want to go, you can open up any door for me. You have a bigger Rolodex, which means you have a bigger contacts list than I do, than I ever will. And if you ever wanted to align things to make it work for me, then you're going to make it happen. So instead of me trying to blaze my own trail, I'm going to choose